Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mad in America. Our guest for today is Dr. Laurence Kirmayer, who is a prominent Canadian psychiatrist known for his pioneering work in the field of cultural psychiatry and Indigenous mental health. He has made significant contributions to understanding how cultural, social, and historical factors fundamentally shape our experience, including that of mental health and ill health. As a researcher and clinician, Dr. Kirmayer has been particularly focused on studying topics like cultural identity, personhood, migration, metaphors, and trauma. His work has been instrumental in challenging the conventional one-size-fits-all approach to psychiatric treatment, advocating for more personalized care that is fundamentally built upon the cultural context of individuals. Dr. Kirmayer, welcome to Mad in America.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
All right. So the first thing we'll talk about is the one concept that goes through much of your writing, that is culture, right? And I know that there is this idea we have that we can understand people somehow in isolation, or that we can study culture as an afterthought, as an add-on, right? And or we can isolate it, or we can integrate it, which is absurd, as if in any way we could study people without their context. And you have, of course, written that we are fundamentally cultural beings. So could you explain or just describe what you mean by that?
Sure. I think this is an important perspective to really underscore and to try to support in several different directions, because there's a strong tendency to assume that the ways of looking at people that are built into psychology and psychiatry and the psi disciplines are somehow universally applicable in precisely the same way, rather than recognizing that they have a particular history that involves, in fact, culture and ways of life and so on. So that's one aspect of why we have to foreground culture. And the other is that nowadays in psychiatry in particular, there's a strong tendency to try to frame mental health problems as about biology, neurobiology in particular, the human brain, and to assume that that's automatically universal, that as long as we understand what the brain's doing, we'll know something useful about everybody everywhere. While there's certainly truth to that we have similar bodies around the world and many other similarities that are useful to get started in getting to know each other, it remains that human beings are fundamentally cultural beings in the sense that we're born in a very immature and vulnerable state with a very plastic brain, a brain that is ready to be shaped and modeled and programmed and stuffed full of all kinds of cultural knowledge and ways of looking at the world and so on. And that's how we adapt. We don't have the sharpest claws or the longest teeth or the warmest fur or anything, and yet we have populated the whole world in many different kinds of ecological niches. We've created many different kinds of societies and kinds of families and kinds of communities, and all that has been done through shared learning and cooperative activity between people. And we're able to do that high level of cooperation and creativity and building, different forms of homes and different forms of environments and different kinds of relationships precisely because of our brain. So in a way, you could say the human brain is the organ of culture. If you say, what's the brain for? It's there basically to allow a baby to acquire this incredibly rich map of a world, or worlds, because nowadays many of us move between different kinds of environments, to acquire that and to know how to navigate that, how to use that to adapt and to get along and so on. So that differentiates us from other animals. I mean, we have other things in common with animals. We have certain basic emotions and responses where we can see similarities with other animals, and yet so much of what we do, most of what we do, depends on these more complex mental faculties or abilities that we have, and those in turn are fundamentally social. Learning a language, for example, which is the main vehicle of culture, the most powerful and elaborate vehicle of culture that we have, is something that really changes how we function, changes how we view the world, gives us all kinds of possibilities. So that's the sense in which I mean culture, not, and it's important to make this point, not how it's sometimes used in psychology and, in Canada, culture sometimes is, oh, that's something that people who come from somewhere else have. We just do things the way they are. And we're just people. And those people from over there, they're a little bit different, a little bit weird, and they have culture. And we'll describe their differences, the different way they dress, or the foods they eat, or the ways that they pursue spirituality, or so on. And that's culture. Whereas the way I'm describing it right now, we are all deeply and fundamentally cultural beings. As soon as you learn to speak a language, or not even speak a language at a nonverbal level, as soon as you know how to be present physically with other people and to relate in a way that has a certain amount of synchrony, a certain amount of resonance with each other, you're already being shaped and becoming a cultural being.
So before we get into more of this, here's a personal question. Then why the interest in studying cultures? Where did it come from? Was it a personal thing? Was it an academic thing?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of all of those, a personal thing, a social political thing, and an academic thing. So the personal element I'll begin with, which is that I come from a family of, I guess what now, second generation immigrants. My grandparents came from Eastern Europe. From the Ukraine, actually, which is a salient place right now, and the Ukraine and what's now Romania. And they came as sort of poor working class Jews who were living in an environment where there were frequent pogroms and violent anti-Semitic attacks. So my great grandfather came, and it took him 10 years to North America. It took him 10 years to save up enough money to bring his wife and children. So a very difficult migration story, which now we would say, well, that sounds like a refugee, but there wasn't such a category, because that's really the creation of an international human rights and legal regime. So they were fleeing this kind of difficult situation, and they found a place in Canada where they could rebuild their lives. And so I grew up in a context where there was a recognition of that story and the importance of that story. And Canada is unusual in some ways in that, because of a very high level of diversity, because of the fact of both English and French settler societies, and more recently because of a serious acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples as having been there beforehand, there has sort of grown up a political ideology of multiculturalism, which basically says we should acknowledge diversity. That diversity is not something to sweep under the rug. And most nation states have created a fiction of similarity. That's how they create their identity. They pick a dominant group, or they pick some dominant element, and then they describe themselves that way. But in reality, everywhere in the world, India is a great example. I mean, huge diversity. Indonesia, huge in diversity. And Canada has embraced this diversity very explicitly politically. So I grew up, first of all, with that personal story of having been vulnerable and people having looked for a place where they could live their lives. Also in a political environment where there was an acknowledgement of difference, and even a celebration of it, a respect for it, and even an attempt to support it. And then I had the good fortune along the ways I trained initially in psychology, and then I went to medical school, and I met along the way some medical anthropologists who taught about the diversity of healing systems and perspectives around the world, which for me was utterly fascinating. When we talk about culture, we're not just talking about somebody who's the designated other. Oh, you're an immigrant from somewhere else, so you have culture. We're talking about all the taken for granted background information, ways of life, implicit values, things that we do automatically, we've learned to do automatically, that just make us feel comfortable and make us able to do what we want to do. All that is part of the fabric of culture.
So that brings us to this point that culture is fundamental to what is psychopathology. Could you tell us some of the most interesting examples of just different ways across the world of looking at human distress and what people consider distressing and how they understand it and make meaning?
Yeah, you're framing this with several different kinds of terms that we use that maybe, if we think about where they come from and what they're telling us, helps me to respond to your question. So you use the term psychopathology, which implies, okay, there's some problem in the psyche. Psyche is a word that comes to us from Greek, and it means something interior. It means mind. It's not a word that exists in the same way in every culture. When we talk about this, when we talk about cultural difference, we're going to find always both similarity and difference, because we're made up of similar stuff, and we have certain existential universals. We're all born. We're born in a vulnerable state. We grow and change dramatically. Eventually, we get sick and we suffer and we die. These are like the Buddhists, the noble truths that we have to pay attention to make sense of what this is all about. So you could say those are existential universals. They depend on our biology, but they're also depend on the nature of human experience. And in a sense, they get rediscovered and reinvented and reshaped in every cultural tradition. So I want to give that as a big backdrop, because then the fact that we have psychopathology per se, and we have psi disciplines like psychology and psychiatry, and is, I wouldn't say an artifact exactly, but it's a consequence of a particular history, a particular way certain kinds of knowledge have been divided up, and eventually in the last 100+ years institutionalized in terms of professions, in terms of structure of healthcare systems, so on and so forth. It's not the same everywhere else. Things don't get divided up. Even though human experience has many of the same facets, they don't get divided up the same way. They don't get lumped together in quite the same way, and so on. So I began in this area once I got exposed to some anthropology. I was also being trained and beginning to function as a psychiatrist, working in a general hospital where I did consultation liaison psychiatry. And that is a role where you see people who have a physical illness. For example, for many years, I was the consultant to the dialysis unit in our hospital. And I should say, when I would come to see them and they'd be introduced to the psychiatrist coming to see you, people were often very defensive. And they said, I don't need to see a psychiatrist. I have a serious physical problem. I have no mental health problems. And this is disturbing to me. Implies that there's something wrong with me in a way that is more stigmatized and that has all kinds of consequences. And I would explain that that's not what I'm here for. It may be that this is so stressful that you are having some problems that we should talk about that would fall in what we would call a psychological domain or adaptation. But basically, I'm here to talk about healthy adaptation and coping strategies that you can use that I've learned from working with other people. So I'm kind of, as an expert, a conduit for that shared experience. So this brings us back to the idea of diagnoses. What are we labeling when we say, oh, this person has a depression? And some of those people that I saw on dialysis and some of the people that I would see in primary care, and we did research in primary care and so on, I'll describe in a moment, would fit those criteria that we had, DSM-3 and DSM-4 and DSM-5 and ICD and all these other systems we have of listing different types of problems. Some of those people would have symptoms that fit that quite well. The practical question you're raising is, well, how well does that work? At the same time, there was a literature, and this speaks to your question about culture, a literature that was emerging from anthropology, notably at that time, there was an important paper in the late 70s by Arthur Kleinman looking at depression in Taiwan and in North America, where he had trained and worked. And he was doing ethnographic research, anthropological research in Taiwan. And he described how people there who had some of the same symptoms as depression were not talking or focusing on those. They were focusing on physical symptoms. So this is what got called somatization, or one aspect of what we call somatization, because the assumption was, well, depression, in the way we talk about it here in Canada and US, is a mental disorder, a psychological disorder, emotional problem, and you should be talking about your emotions, that you feel sad or that you're not feeling emotions you expect to feel, and that's a problem, and that's how you should frame it. But when he looked at people in China, or in this case in way that they were describing their problems were of feeling irritable, of feeling fatigue, of feeling pain, of feeling heaviness, a lot of physical symptoms. And so this got written about as somatization, and many people were making this comparison. Now, the puzzling thing for me when I read that literature was, as I said, I was working in the hospital, seeing people who were not coming to psychiatry. They were coming to their family doctors. They were coming to the nephrologist or whoever. And when they had some symptoms of depression, I still saw that the main way was with physical symptoms. They were not coming and saying, doctor, I think I'm depressed. They were coming and saying, I'm exhausted and tired all the time. I can't do anything. Help me. So this for me is very important, because there was this description of Asians somatize, Africans somatize. I mean, everybody except Westerners somatizes. And then lo and behold, when you go to primary care here, North Americans somatize. Although plenty of the North Americans here, I should say, I live in the hospital where I work, 65% of the people came from outside the country. So we have people from all over. But in any event, even people who were born here, generations here, Euro-Canadians in the sense of people who came originally from various Northern other European countries, they still tended to present to their family doctor, even if they had signs of depression, mainly with physical symptoms. So the lesson there partly was, first of all, the norm around the world is to express suffering in physical symptoms.
I think you've written also that there is a bias against, somatization. There is this tendency to think in the side disciplines that that if you emotionally express and if you emotionally process or if you psychologically figure something out, it is somehow truer or more authentic or superior to having an experience in your body. So do you think that bias that is inherent in our in psychology and psychiatry had something to do with the fact that we completely ignored that, hey, people in our own culture are also showing all of these bodily things?
Well, there's a symmetry between the sort of biomedical physician who's just looking for something in the body, who ignores how people are feeling, and the very psychologically oriented practitioner who's looking for how you're feeling and ignores what's going on in the body. Actually, Pete Fabrigar years ago did a study. He looked at people on a psychiatric ward in a hospital and asked them about physical symptoms. And they all had many, many physical symptoms, but nobody was talking to them about it because it was like, okay, you don't have a serious medical illness, so it's not interesting to us that you're actually feeling bad in all kinds of different ways. And so there is a bias built into how we've sort of cleaved apart. This is sometimes portrayed as it's in one aspect of mind-body dualism in a way, but in a sense, it's just what's happened with professionalization and with certain sort of silos of looking at human experience in a way. And then theories that justify that, as you said, as you implied, the theories that say, well, look, where the action really is in psychology. And that's where it really is. The rest is not important. Or the opposite, as I say, in mainstream psychiatry in North America today, it's the opposite claim. It's like, well, it's all really about the brain, and psychology is just an epiphenomenon. It's just a thing that happens, accidentally because the brain's going about its business. And lo and behold, we have consciousness and awareness and all these other things. And they're all treated as like, we don't have to pay too much attention to that, except as a way to diagnose something, because where the action is these brain mechanisms. So if we say instead that, look, human suffering has many, many different dimensions, and we're talking now about body and mind, if you will, or psychology, but it has social dimensions, it has spiritual dimensions, it has relational dimensions. My friend, the storyteller Joyton Pinelli, used to say, nature is prodigiously complex. So we can say, well, human experience is prodigiously complex. Now, as a practitioner trying to help her, we want to simplify because we want to get a hold of something where we can say, well, here's one aspect and we can make a bit of a difference by focusing on that. But we need to be honest and recognize that's only one facet, and that we're coming at it because those are the tools we have. That's how we were trained. But that's only looking through a keyhole at something that's more complex. So I think that's the basic position. And even if you want to talk about depression, then cross-culturally, once you start saying, okay, so there's a state one can get into, a brain state perhaps to some degree, that where you're not responding well to ordinary social input and reinforcers and so on, and you're stuck now because of that. There's a psychological state in which you're full of pessimistic and self-deprecatory thoughts, and they're just looping around over and over and grinding you down. But there's also a social position that you're now occupying that is preventing you from getting out of that. So if we think in that multi-level way, or a spiritual position you're in where you're viewing, life is not making sense and you've lost sight of the bigger picture. If we view it in that multidimensional way, then we have multidimensional assessment and multidimensional interventions that we can try to guide people toward.
A couple of years ago, I went for this amazing psychiatric conference. It happened in India. It had people from all over the world come in, and it was about social psychiatry for the most part, actually. Just Indian psychiatrists deeply impressed me for the most part in how sensitive they were, especially, and I should mention this, the public sector Indian psychiatrists, right? The ones who were not working in private spaces. Like, they were very open about things like poverty and oppression and marginalization and casteism and gender violence. These are the things that cause mental health issues. But it came back to the fact that even though we know about these structural determinants of mental health and we've started talking about them, when I asked them a simple question that, okay, so what do you do then? You've told me that farmer suicide is about policy changes and all of these reasons in India. And then when I asked them, how do you fix it? The first answer I got was, well, antidepressants have been shown to be useful. And I was like, really? We eventually just immediately move back that a problem is caused by social, historical, policy issues, the poverty of Indian farmers. Oh my God, the marginalization. And what do you do when he's suicidal? You give them antidepressants. Or the second response I got was, it's complicated, which I remember Arthur Kleinman writing about it. That's an absolute cop out, right? So what can we do then as side disciplines? We have acknowledged that inequality plays a huge role, dominant role in human distress and mental disorders and all of that. But we immediately go back to individual solutions. This is kind of connected with the fact, something that you wrote, which is that psychiatric concepts and categories, I'm quoting you, bear the traces of their colonial origins and reflect current structural inequities maintained by constructs of race and ethnicity. So, if these concepts and categories inherently have colonial traces, like you've written, and they reflect the current structural inequities, I don't know if we can use these same concepts when we are saying that structural determinants and structural inequities, are causing these mental disorders.
Well, it comes back to the famous, quote from Audre Lorde about how the master's tools will not help us dismantle the master's house. So you framed it, I think, a very important way in terms of the history and the enduring structures. We talk about the colonial era. We're supposedly in a post-colonial era, but really part of what's happened is there are new structures of domination. Some of them are built on the old, and some are really global social media. And we're at a moment when I think corporations and a small number of very wealthy people are hijacking systems. So it's not that they're pursuing national interests, but they're pursuing interests that may be at odds with the needs of everyday people. That's another dilemma. The question is how to become aware of these and how to do something useful with them. I think that one thing that helps in a very mundane way is when people are in a predicament, to not totally personalize it is helpful. So this is what the core of sort of the kind of narrative therapy that Michael White and David Epstein proposed, in which you're looking not just at the person's story, their own, which is very important. How do they understand? How do they get here? How do they understand what, the trajectory of their life or the nature of the world they're in right now? But you're helping to reveal the larger narratives that we're all embedded in. And by doing that, you're helping the person perhaps not to blame themselves so much, to understand better what they're up against. Their initial example was around eating disorders, or one of their initial examples, and how ideas of what a woman's body should look like and so on that circulate in global mass media and so on have powerful impacts on people. And we need to understand that. And working with an individual person or a family, whatever, bringing that element into play is helpful in terms of people understanding, okay, this is what I'm negotiating with. It's not just my internal struggle, let's say. So there's that level of just naming names, of saying, here's the problem. This is racism. This is poverty, is very, very, soul crushing. And this is what's going on. And then the challenge is, okay, so what can you do about those? So as I said, one is just recognition as already something, because you're at least attributing your problem to the right thing and not bumping your head up against things that are implacable or blaming yourself for things and further disempowering yourself. There's another larger level, which is outside the immediate clinical setting, but sometimes it manifests in our interactions with people, which is advocacy. So there are things you can do to intervene on behalf of a person, to get them access to resources, to push back on the lack of certain resources or attending to certain things and work toward fixing those. So that's another kind of activity. And I think for most clinicians, what needs to happen, and this comes back again to building a kind of theory of what we're doing that acknowledges the systemic nature of human functioning and mental health problems. So that even if we intervene at the individual, like you're living with racism, you're not going to go out tomorrow and make that disappear. That's built into the society. Casteism is built into the society. It's not going to change tomorrow. But by being aware of it helps, finding solidarity with other people helps, and having a certain set of strategies for what you can do in different types of situations, which, again, a practitioner has to become more familiar with those and be able to give good examples of here's a way to deal with it, here's a way to make sense of it. And then there can be small structural changes. So to do that properly, though, in terms of helpers, we need to have the right picture of the world, a more complete theory that includes those things, that doesn't push them off to one side. And we need a toolkit, again, where we have other kinds of interventions, systemic interventions, allies within the community and within that we can draw in on an individual basis and so on, and then lend our voice to structural changes. So in Canada, for example, we have a long history of the government systematically oppressing Indigenous peoples. It was part of the whole policy of, and framed as these things often are in colonial contexts, in a benevolent way, that the Indigenous people are all primitive, same way that tribal peoples sometimes get talked about in India, they're all primitive. So what we're going to do is bring them up to European level. We'll take kids away from their homes and we'll put them in residential schools at the age of 5, and they won't see their parents anymore, and we'll just teach them how to be good little Euro-Canadian kids. Predictably, from a contemporary point of view, this had very, very painful and difficult effects for many people. And we're now at a point where in Canada there has been a recognition of this history. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We had a formal apology. We had a whole process of reconciliation and restitution that's ongoing. And the report of this Royal Commission declared that Canada had committed cultural genocide. That's very powerful language, very painful language for people who like to think of themselves as moral beings. And it's an important step in terms of helping communities and individuals in seeing what's going on and beginning to find their way through. And we just had last week, actually, more concretely, the government meeting with people of Haida Gwaii in the West Coast as they sign over, the government signs over or returns to Haida Gwaii ownership of the island that they've had since time immemorial. So these kinds of very concrete, very meaningful, politically, economically, redistribution of power that do happen.
You have, of course, written about the importance of language and metaphors and how people's experience is shaped, right? And I'm especially thinking about connecting that with historical trauma, right? This concept that is now really, it used to mean one thing, but it has been misused and co-opted for native populations. So what are the effects, the looping effects on the identity of Indigenous people when they are kind of construed through deficient statistics and just called all traumatized? Because I saw how trauma has been co-opted in India in the service of some very nationalist ideas and things like that, posing a group of people as perpetually traumatized.
Well, there's several layers to this that are important. I mean, it starts with what you just said, that we use certain language and certain metaphors and certain models to describe a reality that's always more complex than those models. So the metaphor we choose, the metaphor of trauma, originally trauma in Greek meant, getting a physical wound. You went to battle and you got bonked on the head and you now had a trauma. It now means all these kind of emotionally violent events that leave their marks on people. But by reifying trauma, we ignore the point Mel Konner made, that all throughout human history, from the earliest evolution of human beings, we faced violent environments and difficulty, and we have resilient systems. We have coping systems so that these don't destroy us necessarily all the time. So that's where we should be starting from, is saying, look, the world is tumultuous, and every life is going to be marked by grave difficulty, and oftentimes we're able to keep going, which doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt us, that we're not wounded, that we aren't affected and shaped by these. But we should not start from a position of that these events necessarily mean that people are now completely stuck. And many Indigenous people make this point that, yes, we've faced repeated violence and structural violence and disqualification, and we're still here. And we're still here, and we're still holding on to aspects of our tradition, even those were deliberately targeted. It's not just that those were pushed aside with modernity, but they're actually active efforts to, eradicate the languages, eradicate the spiritualities. So that's what historical trauma is trying to point to, that and say, look, it wasn't just one event, it wasn't just a moment of overt violence, but it was structures that really, really ground us down and really disenfranchised us. The critique that we've written about this is that's all true, and it's very important to label that, but there are ongoing structural problems also. So talking about it historically, it's important, but it's not at all the whole story. Also because Indigenous people in North America adopted this metaphor of trauma, historical trauma, partly because of the influence of the whole discussion of the Holocaust. But what happened in that instance was the people who survived actually mostly moved away and rebuilt their lives in other environments completely. That's very different than what's happened for Indigenous people who are in their place, in their land, and maybe they're being displaced just outside of the choice land to make room for a city or something, but they are being enclosed and they have no place to go. So it's a very different dynamic, and there's this ongoing inequity. So the concern always is we use a metaphor like historical trauma, and we're trying to mobilize an understanding that there are powerful external forces that are causing the suffering of people. There's a history, there's a politics, there's issues of human rights that need to be front and center. But there's also ongoing dilemmas. So the metaphor is only going to be, or the model is only going to be a partial model. We need other things. And people have taken that on, trying to see the trauma as something that is inscribed in some ways. There's a whole sort of trauma theory that becomes overly simplified in terms of how people respond. And so rather than seeing how people do find ways through this individually and collectively, we can get stuck in a rigid model. And again, many people have adopted the psychological idiom, and then it pushes aside the political. So for me, it's a question of how do we find the interplay between these? It's certainly helpful for people to have a way to manage their own acute suffering and understanding the dynamics of how, fear conditioning and the kinds of disruptions that people experience with trauma, how those work is very important. But understanding the ongoing adversity that people have is equally important. So that's where I would say, my interest in metaphor and language has two sides to it. It's what's the language we use to make sense of problems professionally and in other settings, and what's the language we use individually every day in trying to articulate our own world. And those two things play back and forth. In other words, I can adopt the word trauma that's part of a professional discourse and suddenly becomes the way that I'm looking at my own world. And that has the basic attitude I would take with all these is any metaphor or model is always a partial truth, and it's always going to have trade-offs. It's going to reveal some things and it's going to hide other things. So rather than just saying, oh, great, there's the right metaphor, that's the flavor of the month, I'm on board, we can use it, but we should also say, okay, but what is this leaving out? What are we not seeing here that we need to consider? Because that word comes with extra meanings that maybe are not quite right for the situation we're in, or it's excluding something that should be in the foreground that we need to think about. So we're better off having many metaphors, and that's part of what we do in therapy with people, where we try to help them generate more metaphors and see, does this one open a door for you that the other one didn't?
I remember reading a chapter where somebody said, in a post-therapeutic world, therapists, let's say, would be curators of narratives. And I thought that was beautiful, So I'm going to end on one last question. What are some of the things that some narratives that are just assumed in our side disciplines and discourse that are also narratives, but we see them as truth? Like, what you said, they have a culture and I don't, and they have an accent and I don't, and they have narratives and we have, truth.
I just finished a book on healing and metaphor, and I'm working on another book on the mind-body problem now. These are really summations of like 30 years of writing on this stuff. And the problem we have overall is still this ontology that says physical things, this is in the West, biology and so on, are real, and that's where the action is. And language and stuff is sort of after the fact. That we try to describe things, we try to make sense of things, but the power is not there. And what I think we need to recognize is that the ways we look at the world, the ways we interpret this very complex thing that we're involved in, are not only powerful, but they're actually constitutive of a lot of what's going on. That so many things we do are, what the philosopher Austin called, performative utterances. If we say, I now pronounce you man and wife, we've created a new kind of institutional relationship that has all kinds of concrete consequences for people over these ensuing years. If we say, you have a psychiatric problem, your diagnosis is such and such, we've created a situation that a person now can work with for better or for worse. Not always for worse. Maybe that label opens the doors to getting some help, to getting some treatment, to them saying, okay, I think I know what's going on for me now. I have a plan. But maybe it also has unintended consequences, that people are now disqualified in a certain way, that they don't look at other options, and so on. So if we understand that kind of view of language as constitutive of what's going on, not in a or sort of radical constructivist way where say that's the only thing. Language is not the only thing. We live in a world of material structures of other people, of things that are not just mediated by language, but a lot of what we do is mediated by language. So taking that very seriously means that we should choose our words carefully, that we should be paying attention to things. And so the idea that language can be illuminating at the same time as it might, we turn our metaphoric lens to one or light to one corner and it's thrown into relief. And in the meantime, other things are in the shadows that we're not paying attention to. So we need that metaphoric mobility. And for me, that's where paying some attention to the language, paying attention to what poets have to tell us who are trying to generate really fresh metaphors and really startle us awake with a kind of a new view is really a very important source of individual healing, of getting our way out of the box that we're in, but also of collective healing in terms of saying what are we taking for granted in our economic system? We hear constantly these days, society, our economy is growing. Why is it a good thing for an economy to keep growing? The only thing that grows without bounds, is a tumor. So there's something ecologically wrong with this idea that everything needs to keep growing all the time. And there are people working on green economics and so on, trying to say, what would it mean to live in some kind of balance? So that things are improving in the sense of being distributed more fairly and people having the option to pursue things that are not all about material accumulation, but about the aesthetics of life, about moral values, about building together. So that's challenging a very core metaphor and value that we hear repeated all the time and used to justify all kinds of things and political decisions and so on, that some people would argue is already a flawed metaphor for the human situation that we're living in. And we see it manifested with global warming and so on. So we can take almost any area like that and sort of say, okay, how are we construing it? What do we gain? Who gains what? What do we see with that? And what's missing? So for me, that's been extremely useful for me in terms of my own attempts to do something a bit creative within the confines of a certain profession and to challenge some of the assumptions of the institution and to show ways of enlarging, if you will, the metaphors or creating more options for us.
It reminds me of in Hindi, I use this example with my students, especially American students, which is that instead of being an alcoholic, as you can be if you're speaking English, in Hindi, what you would say is he who drinks. Like her husband is someone who drinks, right? It is very common for people to be extremely heavy drinkers and then stop and then drink occasionally because there is no narrative that is constantly telling you that you have failed if you have a drink every once in a while.
Yeah, so I would just say that I absolutely, it's a beautiful example. And for me, the challenge is between that view that seems to give us an opening and possibilities, and the fact that not everything yields to our language, that we have to respect the fact that people could have the best language and the best intentions and still be up against very obdurate problems. And for me, that's an ethical stance as a helper or whatever, not to oversimplify or get overly optimistic for people when they are really struggling.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.